Welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about tissues, specifically epithelial tissue. So if you remember back to, it was maybe chapter 1 or 2, you will remember that tissues are actually formed by groups of similar cells that are organized for a common purpose. And there are 4 main types of tissue in the human body. Epithelial tissue, what we're going to be talking about today, covers the body and lines the internal organs. Connective tissue kind of binds together, connects everything, and supports structures in the body. Muscular tissue is important with movement, both of the body and within the body. And nervous tissue is involved with communication. When you think about tissues, I want you to think about the structure versus the function. There's a relationship between structure and function, and thinking about this can help you remember all these different tissue types. So the structure is what something looks like, and the function is how something works or what it does. And you probably are already familiar with this concept. Think about your teeth. We all know that when you have an animal that does a lot of meat eating and they're sort of ripping and tearing at their food, they're going to have large canines. And this is because canines are pretty pointy and they work very well for biting into something and ripping into something. So the structure is this pointy shape and the function is tearing apart meat. Conversely, an animal that doesn't do that, something that eats a lot of grass, would have a lot more molars. And molars have this very sort of large, broad, flat surface on the top that's really good for grinding grains or grass or something like that. So a cow has really big molars. So the structure is how flat it is and how wide it is, and the function is they eat a lot of grass. So structure and function are really important. That relationship between them can help you relate what something looks like and what its function is. All right, moving on. So epithelial tissue, as we already said, covers the body and lines the body surfaces. You would find epithelial tissues in the skin, which covers the body, inside the hollow organs, so inside the heart, inside the blood vessels, inside the digestive tract, as well as in the membranes. So the characteristics of epithelial tissue are that the cells are really tightly packed together. There's a lot of cells. Imagine having a whole bunch of people that are standing around and you line them up next to each other to shoulder to shoulder to shoulder to shoulder. And they're attached at the shoulder and the hip. So they form these sort of sheets that will cover the body and line body surfaces. In order to hold these cells together, we need intracellular junctions. And this is a review from last chapter. There are 3 types of junctions that you're responsible for. One is the adhesion junction, and that holds cells together. And the second is tight junctions, and these hold cells together even more tightly. So if you can imagine the 2 plasma membranes of the cells that are standing next to each other are almost fused together. So they form a watertight barrier. And then the third type is gap junctions, and this is where you have kind of a tunnel from one cell cytoplasm to another cell's cytoplasm. So if you want to share materials between those 2 cells, you don't have to go through all the plasma membranes to get from one cell to another. And you can have more than one junction in a type of tissue. So for example, you can have a bunch of adhesion junctions that hold the cells together, but you can also have some gap junctions in there so that they can share materials. So those cells are held down onto a basement membrane. If I were to draw this out, I could draw a bunch of cells. You see how they're all kind of right next to each other? And they're held together, maybe by adhesion junctions, so that nobody's going anywhere. And then on the bottom, there would be this membrane. And the cells are actually held down onto the membrane too. So this whole thing, this whole structure is almost like, think of like a bed sheet, something that you could kind of throw out there and cover the entire mattress. Now, the other thing about epithelial tissues is that they are avascular. And what that means is that they don't have their own blood supply. So underneath the basement membrane, you might have a blood vessel, and that's carrying nutrients and oxygen and things that the cells need. However, the epithelial tissue itself is too tightly packed together. There's too many cells, there's no room for blood vessels, and so anything that you need has to be brought in by the blood vessel and has to sort of get from this interstitial space around the blood vessel into the cells. So what happens is if you have too many layers of epithelial tissue, those cells at the top layers up here don't get enough nutrients and they end up dying. Now, the epithelial tissues are named really nicely. They are named for their shape and for the number of layers there are. So I've drawn one layer of cells here. You see how I just have one layer and then the basement membrane? That's called simple. Simple because there's just one layer, so that's simple to remember. But if I put another layer on top here, here's my second layer of epithelial cells, and each of these cells is held down to the layer below by junctions and held together by other junctions, right? So if you had all of these cells, you would end up having 2 layers, and that is going to be stratified. So stratified is 2+ layers. Simple is just 1 layer. We're also going to name this by the shape of the cell. So if you look at these cells, they're just about as wide as they are tall. So they're little cubes, right? If you took math, you would be learning about like the volume of a cube. So these are called cuboidal cells because they're about the same width as they are high. So this tissue that I've drawn here, you can see the basement membrane underneath. These are stratified cuboidal cells because there's 2 layers and they're kind of square looking. So our 3 shapes are squamous, which are kind of long and thin. You see how thin this is from the side. Cuboidal, which are just about as tall as they are wide. And columnar, which are tall, sort of skinny cells. And then we have simple. So if we look at this, we've got our basement membrane on the bottom that holds the cells down into their sheet. And then we've got cells that are tall and skinny. So this would be simple columnar. These cells over here are stratified. You can see that there's 1, 2, 3, and then a whole bunch more layers, right? So remember, 2 or more layers is stratified. So these are stratified, and they're called stratified squamous cells. Why are they called squamous when they look like little cubes down on the bottom? Well, it's because we name epithelial tissues based on their shape at the apical surface. So the apical surface is this sort of the free surface, the surface that either is outside the body or towards the lumen or the hollow space inside an organ. So because these cells have this sort of smushed flat shape to them, they're squamous on the apical surface. Now there's one other designation, and that is pseudostratified columnar. Pseudo means fake. And pseudostratified columnar, you can see that they're columnar cells, but the reason we call them fake stratified is because they look like there's more than 1 layer, but if you look, every single cell is touching the basement membrane. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. So by putting the number of layers first and then the shape second, so this goes first and this goes second, we can name all these different types of tissues. And in fact, there are 5 different tissues that you have to learn. There's way more than this in reality, but you only have to learn 5 for this class. But what I do want you to keep in mind is that the structure influences the function, and the function is influenced by the location. So these things all go together. So when you're memorizing these, make sure to take into account the structure versus the function. What do I mean by that? Well, this first type of tissue right here is really, really, really thin, right? It's 1 cell layer thick, and the cell is that thin, thin, thin squamous material. This is really bad for protecting you from anything because it's literally like one cell can get rubbed away really fast. But it's really, really good if you wanted to maybe have oxygen go through this tissue. Oxygen can diffuse right through very easily. Whereas something down here that's got lots and lots and lots of layers would take forever for oxygen to get through. So that's not a very good function for it. So the structure, what it looks like, influences the function, what it does. Let's look at each of these individually. So our first of the 5 types of epithelium you need to learn is simple squamous. And we can just look at the name and we can tell what it is. Simple means one layer. Squamous means squished cells. So if you think about it, these are thin, single layer of cells. And if you think about the function of that, that is not going to be something that you're going to use for a ton of protection or making anything because they're really, 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 really thin. And so their function is actually diffusion. Remember we talked about how oxygen and carbon dioxide can move right through this layer relatively easily because it's only 2 little plasma membranes and they can go straight through the plasma membrane because they are small and nonpolar. Okay, and where you're going to find these is someplace where you do a lot of diffusion. So for example, the air sacs of the lungs, the alveoli, we're going to have carbon dioxide moving from the blood out into the lungs so you can breathe it out. Oxygen that you've brought into the lungs moving through this membrane into the capillaries. And back down into the tissues, the capillary walls are also made of simple squamous epithelium for the same exact reason. We've got oxygen that's going to be leaving the blood and going into the tissues, and carbon dioxide waste that was created in the tissues leaving that space and coming back into the blood. And so again, if you know the structure of something, you can make some assumptions about what does it do, what's its function. And if you know the structure and the function, you can think about, well, does that make sense that this is where you would find it? You're not going to find simple squamous epithelium covering the body because, you rub up against, a doorway and you've pretty much put a hole in your skin. Okay, our next one is simple cuboidal, and we can tell that this is one cell layer, and it is relatively little square cells. So the cells are just about as wide as they are tall. And here, they're not really that thin anymore. So we're not going to use this for diffusion. We're going to we have some space in this cell, and we can make stuff in the cell. We can take things that we made in the cell, and then we can kind of spit it out. Or if these cells are lining a tube and there's stuff in the tube, we can import it into the cell. And so the function here is absorption and secretion. And you would find this in places where you're doing a lot of absorption or secretion. You're doing a lot of absorption in the kidney tubules, and you're doing a lot of secretion there too, and also in the glands. Our next type is simple columnar. Simple is one layer, and columnar is tall, skinny cells. And you can actually see how tall these cells are. Really goes far above the basement membrane. So these are single layer of tall, skinny cells. And again, because they're so big, you're not going to do all that much, diffusion or anything through them. But they're so tall, they help to protect. They're going to do some absorption and secretion as well because there's a lot of room in the cell, but they're mostly going to be protecting. And you see this in the lining of the small intestine. So this is a radiomicrograph, and you can see sort of some intestinal matter here, and then you can see that these cells are lining this tubule. And so if it's very acidic or if there's a lot of roughage in there and it's very abrasive, this will protect the tissue that is underneath. Now, one thing you can see here that's interesting that I want you to know about is something called a goblet cell. This goblet cell is going to secrete mucus. So goblet cells tend to be associated with simple columnar epithelium, and they secrete mucus, again, as a protective mechanism in areas where there's a lot of abrasion and a lot of pH changes and a lot of digestion, chemical digestion. Don't forget in the intestines, we're doing a lot of digestion, and so we have a lot of enzymes that are breaking down proteins and carbohydrates, and we want to protect our own cells so they don't get broken down. Okay, here we are. We're finally talking about something with more than one layer, stratified squamous epithelium. Let's take a closer look. So here we have our cells sitting on the basement membrane, and we can see that there's multiple layers of cells. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, blah, 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 blah. Lots and lots of cells. And you might think, because of the shape of the cells down here on the basement membrane, that this would be cuboidal, but remember, we actually name tissues based on the apical surface, or the free surface. So if you think about this as like a cross-section of a piece of skin, this would be the part that's inside, and this is the part that you actually see on the outside of your body. And you can see that these cells are very sort of smushed and flat, so these are squamous cells. The other thing that I want you to notice is that, remember that epithelial tissue is avascular, and so it doesn't have its own blood supply. There's really no room for blood vessels to run through this tissue. And so any nutrients or oxygen or anything that we need is coming from this blood vessel. So these cells in the first few layers are okay, and they're getting enough nutrients that diffuse through, but these cells at the top are just way too far away, and they're just basically going to die. So if we were to describe the structure here, the structure would be thin cells, but many, 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 many layers. And the function here is going to be protection. You're going to have this in places where you can afford to lose a few layers, right? So the fact that there's many layers allows you to be able to lose a few and not stress about it. And so where are you going to find this? In places where there's a lot of abrasion. Think places like the skin. So the covering of your body is made of stratified squamous epithelium. The mouth and the anus and the vagina, all areas where you've got a lot of friction that goes on, a lot of abrasion, have stratified squamous epithelium. You don't want to bite a spicy Dorito chip in your mouth and, suddenly poke a hole in your cheek. You want to have a lot of layers to protect you from the heat, the spiciness of it, as well as the pokiness of it. Pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. That is quite a mouthful. So let's go through each of those words here. If you look at it, we know that it's pseudostratified. Remember, pseudostratified is fake stratified. It looks like there's two layers. If you look at the nuclei of these cells, it looks like there's actually two different layers, but there aren't. Every single cell touches the basement membrane. So that's why it's pseudostratified. We know it's columnar because these are tall, thin cells. Ooh, I cannot draw a straight line. Anyway, tall, thin cells. And then again, remember we talked about simple columnar cells before having goblet cells. Pseudostratified columnar cells also have goblet cells, but they also have this other thing on them called cilia. And cilia are little extensions of the plasma membrane that beat back and forth. So they move back and forth, almost like, imagine you go to a rock concert and somebody dives off the stage and everybody puts their arms up and they sort of push that guy around the audience. That's what cilia do. They move material and objects that are sitting on this apical surface. They can move it back and forth across the apical surface of this tissue. The structure of having the cilia helps with the function of what this particular tissue is made for. So the structure are a single layer of columnar cells with cilia on top. The function is actually going to be protection and movement. So protection, just like simple columnar cells, because they're just really tall and big, but also we've got this movement, and the cilia is what gives us the movement. So remember, we have goblet cells secreting mucus out onto this apical surface. And what that's going to do, this tissue is actually found in the respiratory tract, in the trachea. And what that mucus is going to do is it's going to trap little particles of smoke or pollen or pollution or, I don't know, whatever it is you're breathing in. It's going to get trapped in the mucus that sits on this apical surface that was produced by the goblet cells. And then the cilia are going to beat in one direction and push all that mucus and all of that sort of stuff that you don't want to get into your respiratory tract, into your lungs, up the trachea and out, right? So this protects your lungs because of the structure, function, and location of this tissue. And we'll talk a lot more about this when we get to the respiratory tract. That's it for today. See you in class.